The wool of my old coat still clung to my shoulders when my niece Agnes laughed. "Careful, Aunt Lydia, you're unraveling." Still, I buttoned it slowly, right over the pocket where her unpaid loan sat folded in half. As her friends chuckled behind champagne glasses, I felt the weight of her estate on my signature. While she toasted her success across the room, I traced the date on the lien papers with my thumb. The same aunt she mocked was the guarantor she never thanked. That's when I left the table and handed her debt to the club director mid-toast. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Lydia stood at the edge of the Oak Ridge Country Club's grand ballroom, surrounded by people who seemed to move in slow motion, elegantly posed and glossy, as though their lives were carefully curated for this moment. The crystal chandeliers gleamed above, and the polished floors reflected the light in sharp, almost painful brilliance. It was everything Lydia had never been, and yet, here she was, dressed in her favorite coat, a hand-stitched wool masterpiece she'd designed herself many years ago. The coat, though worn with age, still felt like armor to her, a shield against the world that often saw her as nothing more than an outdated relic. She reached for a scone, her fingers just brushing the flaky, golden surface when Agnes's voice cut through the gentle hum of conversation like a sharpened blade. "Careful, Aunt Lydia, that coat looks ready to unravel." The words echoed in the room, and Lydia froze, her hand still hovering over the scone. A ripple of laughter followed, light and dismissive, but the weight of it settled over Lydia like dust. She could feel the eyes of the room flickering over her, some intrigued, others amused, as though Agnes had just delivered the punchline to a private joke that had been running for years. No one stopped it. No one questioned the cruelty. Lydia didn't react. She didn't need to. Instead, she moved deliberately, slowly, slipping her hands into the deep pockets of the coat. A calmness washed over her, an internal stillness that felt like the eye of a storm. She was aware of the laughter still rippling through the air, but it no longer seemed to matter. The coat was a part of her, a memory stitched together from years of quiet labor and patience. Let them laugh. They had no idea what it held. As her fingers grazed the crinkled paper inside the pocket, she exhaled quietly. The loan papers, the ones she had signed 5 years ago for the Lawson estate remodel. The ones Agnes had long forgotten about, pretending that debts and responsibilities were for other people. People who weren't quite so important, quite so above it all. Lydia's eyes scanned the crowd, but her attention shifted when she caught Ruth Hadley's gaze across the room. Ruth, seated near the back, locked eyes with her expression unreadable at first. Then, in a soft whisper that only Lydia could hear, Ruth's lips barely moved. "Still carrying weight?" Lydia's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. She just nodded subtly, a slight acknowledgement of what neither of them could ignore. She didn't need to answer. Ruth knew exactly what was at stake, and Lydia had no intention of letting anyone, least of all Agnes, forget it. The laughter began to fade, replaced by the quiet murmur of the guests as they returned to their small talk, as though the moment had never happened. Agnes, ever the master of performance, moved on to a new topic, smiling wide as she regaled the crowd with some latest tale of her charitable endeavors, as if nothing had transpired at all. Lydia stood at the table for a moment longer, her hand still resting in her coat pocket. The weight of the loan papers felt heavier now. There was something deeply poetic about it, the coat that had witnessed so much of her life, and now, carrying the debt that would bring everything to light. She glanced at Ruth once more, who offered her a slight, knowing smile, a smile that said, "I see you, and I know what you're about to do." Lydia straightened, taking one last look at the laughter-filled room. The clinking glasses, the polished perfection. The room was still, but Lydia could feel the tension building beneath the surface. It was only a matter of time before things changed, before Agnes's world was upended. The scone sat untouched. Lydia turned, walking away from the table. Every step felt deliberate, every motion filled with purpose. She was no longer the quiet, invisible aunt who wore an old coat. She was something else now, and Agnes wouldn't see it coming. As Lydia moved toward the door, she caught one last glance of Agnes, still laughing, still unaware, still so sure of her place. Lydia's lips curved into the smallest of smiles as she whispered to herself, "It's not just a coat, dear." The door clicked shut behind her, and the room fell silent for the briefest of moments, a stillness before the storm. The drive back from Oak Ridge was a quiet one. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound, a steady rhythm that matched Lydia's thoughts. Steady, unwavering, and cold. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel with the same precision she used when stitching the fine wool of her coat, her mind replaying the moment at the club. Agnes's laugh, the cutting edge of her words. But it was more than just that. There was a weight in Lydia's chest, a familiar heaviness that had nothing to do with the laughter and everything to do with the thing Agnes hadn't noticed, the thing she would never expect. Lydia turned into her driveway, the old house standing still against the winter sky. She parked and sat for a moment, watching the house as if waiting for it to speak. It had been a good house once, but nothing stays good forever. Not in a world where people forget what it costs to hold things together. Inside, the house was cool, a steady temperature she preferred. No air conditioning to filter the seasons, no heat to stifle the crisp winter air. She pulled her coat from her shoulders, hanging it on the back of a chair as she moved to her desk in the corner of the room. There, she reached for the small stack of papers that had been left in an envelope for weeks now, tucked away in a drawer, waiting for this exact moment. Lydia unfolded the top sheet, the crinkled edges of the paper faintly curling with age, and read the loan amount once more, $214,000. The number didn't feel real anymore. It was a number tied to Agnes's ambition and Calvin's failed ventures, to broken promises and desperate phone calls. It was a number that had turned into a thread binding Lydia to their ever-shifting world of debts and demands, and she had been the one to hold it together, quietly, out of sight. The primary guarantor. The one who always bailed them out. Never questioned. Never celebrated. Just expected. Her fingers lingered on the paper for a moment longer. The weight of it was familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. The loan had been a lifeline once, a final hope for Agnes and Calvin to save their crumbling estate. But now it was just a reminder of how little it had mattered to them. Lydia's mind drifted back to the day Agnes had come to her, face streaked with tears, pleading for help. Flashback. "I don't know what we're going to do," Agnes had said, her voice shaking, almost fragile for once. Calvin had stood behind her, silent, his eyes vacant as always. "The estate's in trouble. If we don't fix this, we lose everything. We just need help to stay afloat." Lydia had never been one for drama, never one to indulge the theatrics, but the panic in Agnes's eyes had been enough to sway her. Lydia had nodded slowly, offering the only thing she had, her name. "I'll take care of it," Lydia had said quietly, swallowing the bitterness that rose in her throat. "I'll help." She had been the one to pay the property taxes that winter too, quietly, behind the scenes. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Just a cold transaction. A quiet offering to a niece who couldn't be bothered to appreciate the weight of what she was asking. Present moment, Lydia's fingers tightened around the loan papers as the memory faded. Her eyes flicked down to the sheet in front of her again, her gaze sharp and calculated. Ruth's voice echoed in her head. "She asked you to invest. She spent it like it was owed." Lydia nodded to herself, as though answering Ruth's unspoken reminder. Agnes had never once understood what it meant to be responsible for something larger than her own image, to be tied to something that required more than just a passing glance. Lydia had learned that lesson long ago. When you commit for life. And Agnes? Agnes had spent everything Lydia had given, assuming it was a gift. Not a loan, not a debt. The sound of her own breath was steady as Lydia pulled open the drawer beside her desk. She retrieved a fresh envelope, the smooth paper still crisp in her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the loan papers inside, the same ones she had signed all those years ago, and sealed the envelope shut. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she picked up her pen, writing the label on the front of the envelope with care. Deliver when public image matters most. Her fingers brushed the paper as she held it up, inspecting her neat handwriting. There was something almost poetic about it. The way the envelope sat in her hands, holding the weight of Agnes's future. The debt that had been ignored. The pride that would soon be humbled. Lydia sat back in her chair, the quiet hum of the house settling around her as the night crept closer. Outside, the world seemed still, untouched by the shifting currents beneath the surface. But inside, Lydia could feel the change coming. It was inevitable now. She tucked the envelope into her bag, her heart steady, her purpose clear. The world Agnes had built was about to crumble. And Lydia would be the one to deliver the final blow. The question was no longer if the truth would come to light, but when. And Lydia was in no hurry to make that decision. The timing had to be perfect. The Oak Ridge Country Club was buzzing with its usual mix of genteel airs and careful smiles. Lydia stepped into the grand hall with the same measured pace she always carried, her coat swishing lightly as she moved through the crowd. The same woolen coat that Agnes had mocked just days ago. The room was filled with a predictable mix of faces, bright, polished, posing their best selves, speaking their careful words. But Lydia was beyond caring about their performances. She knew her place here. It had always been on the edges, unnoticed, quiet, and she liked it that way. This time, however, she wasn't just another face in the crowd. She had promised herself she wouldn't let Agnes's words sting. But something about returning to this place, the air thick with pretense and self-importance, made her feel the weight of every laugh that had been directed at her in the past. She knew what they saw when they looked at her, the forgotten aunt, the relic of an old world that no one had the patience for anymore. But in the corners of the room, out of sight, Lydia wasn't just the aunt. She was the keeper of the thread that tied this fragile world together. And soon, that thread would snap. Agnes appeared soon after Lydia entered, her entrance as grand as always. She smiled, but there was an edge to it, the kind that betrayed her unease. She had caught sight of Lydia almost immediately, her gaze narrowing for a moment before she quickly masked it with another smile. "Oh, Aunt Lydia," Agnes said, her voice dripping with feigned warmth as she moved toward her. "You've come back to grace us with your presence again, have you?" She cast a quick glance at Lydia's coat. "Still wearing that old thing, I see. Pity the style doesn't quite match the occasion, does it?" The words felt like an echo of the previous encounter, but this time, they didn't land in the same way. Lydia's lips parted slightly, but she didn't bite. Instead, she simply offered a small, composed smile. "It still fits," she said, her tone calm, the kind of steadiness only years of practice could bring. Agnes's eyes flicked to her for a brief second, her face twitching with something like irritation, but she recovered quickly. "Well, it certainly shows that you're timeless, Aunt Lydia." There was a sweetness to the compliment, but it was tainted with the unmistakable taste of sarcasm. Lydia didn't react to the jab. She wasn't here for games. As Agnes turned her attention back to the group, Lydia moved to the side, quietly slipping the check for the event's scholarship fund into the hands of the organizer at the table. No fanfare, no announcement, just the quiet, deliberate motion of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to gain from attention. The organizer blinked, clearly caught off guard, but nodded and accepted the donation with a professional smile. Lydia's actions spoke louder than any speech Agnes could deliver. While Agnes worked the room, her voice bright and rehearsed, Lydia was quietly moving the pieces of the game. People noticed her, but they didn't know her. They didn't know the depth of the quiet power she held. A ripple of murmurs stirred through the room as Lydia stepped away from the donation table. A few heads turned, whispering behind delicately raised glasses. "Isn't that Agnes's aunt?" one of them asked, the words just audible enough to pierce through the hum of polite conversation. Lydia didn't stop. She didn't turn to see who had spoken. She simply moved through the room with the same unhurried grace she always carried, the weight of her coat's fabric brushing her sides like an old, familiar memory. At the front of the room, Agnes stood at the podium now, glass raised in a deliberate gesture of command. Her smile was wide, but there was a nervousness behind her eyes, a flicker of something raw that she couldn't quite mask. Agnes loved the spotlight, but she had always feared being upstaged. And now, there was something different in the air, a sense that she no longer had the control she thought she did. "Let's toast," Agnes said, her voice ringing out, "to the generosity of this community." Lydia remained at the edge of the room, composed and unreadable, as Agnes's voice rang out across the room. Her gaze flicked up to meet the eyes of the crowd, but instead of seeing the admiration she once commanded, Lydia felt something else. A faint shift in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the balance. Lydia didn't raise her glass. She didn't need to. She had already made her point, quietly, beneath the surface. Agnes's words hung in the air, thinly veiled attempts to reclaim something she had lost, but Lydia had no intention of competing with her niece. Agnes didn't need to know yet that Lydia had already won. And as Lydia stood there in the corner, watching the room swirl around her, watching Agnes try to hold on to the illusion of control, she felt something solidifying in her chest. She wasn't just a forgotten aunt. She wasn't just the woman in the old coat. She was the one who would deliver the final blow when it mattered most. And the time for that would come soon enough. But for now, she would watch, silent and composed, while Agnes played her game. The room fell into its usual rhythm again, the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation returning. Lydia stood still in the corner, and the faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She was ready. She was always ready, and the storm was coming. The envelope sat on Lydia's desk, sealed and waiting, the weight of its contents palpable even in the quiet of her dimly lit study. She hadn't rushed the decision. This had been a slow burn, a careful calculation. Lydia ran a finger along the edge of the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper beneath her skin. It was the kind of paper that demanded respect. No flourishes, no frills. Just business. Her fingers brushed the phone, and she dialed Marla's number, her mind already moving ahead. She could hear the brief rustle of paper on the other end before Marla's voice came through, sharp and composed, just as expected. "Lydia," Marla said, "it's ready." Lydia paused. The moment had arrived. "Do it." There was a slight delay, a quiet sigh on Marla's side, before she answered. "A formal repayment demand, 14-day window. We'll see how they handle it." Lydia sat back in her chair, her eyes focusing on the window beyond the study, the sky already darkening as the evening crept in. It was quiet outside, too quiet, a silence that felt full, pregnant with the promise of what was to come. "The estate is worth 7 figures," Ruth's voice echoed in her mind from their last conversation. "But liquidity?" Lydia could practically hear Ruth's chuckle. Not so much. I'm about to find out. Lydia had answered at the time, her tone even, as though she had all the time in the world to wait for the storm to break. And now, the waiting had begun. A 14-day window was a thin sliver of time, too small to notice at first, but just long enough to build tension. Long enough for Agnes to make a mistake. Lydia would bet on it. She always did. The next day, Lydia sat in the comfort of her quiet home, sipping tea as the days stretched ahead. The mail arrived like clockwork, but she didn't look for it. She knew it would come when it was time. Meanwhile, across town, in the Lawson estate, Agnes was busy overseeing the latest round of renovations. She had never been one to check the details. It was all about appearances for her, how things looked on the surface, how they played to the crowd. "New tile for the guest house," Agnes had said, her voice light with excitement as she chatted with the contractor. "It'll be perfect. I want it finished by the gala. This year has to be different." It was always about the next big thing, the next party, the next status symbol. Agnes hadn't even glanced at the stack of unopened letters on her desk. The letters Lydia had sent over the years, or the recent one with a neat seal stamped across the front. Lydia had warned her once, indirectly, that her penchant for superficial things would be her undoing. She should have checked her mail before she picked new tile. From the safety of her own home, Lydia smiled faintly as she imagined Agnes's reaction when she finally saw the letter, when she finally realized the walls she had so carefully built around her were about to come crumbling down. "She thinks silence means approval," Ruth had said, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Ruth understood. Agnes had always relied on silence as her shield, assuming that Lydia's quiet demeanor meant she didn't care, didn't notice the cracks forming around them. But Lydia wasn't silent anymore, and she wasn't the woman Agnes thought she could dismiss so easily. The repayment demand had been filed. The date had been set. Soon. The estate that Agnes had spent years polishing to perfection would become a liability, a sinking ship that Lydia was poised to watch from a distance, calm, composed, ready for the inevitable fallout. Lydia leaned back in her chair again, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. But it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like control. It felt like patience. It would take time for Agnes to realize what was coming, and when she did, there would be nowhere for her to hide. Lydia could already see the moment unfolding in her mind. Agnes's eyes widening in disbelief as the truth came crashing through her polished life. The timeline was already set in motion, and nothing could stop it now. But for now, Lydia allowed herself a moment of peace. The quiet before the storm. The phone buzzed. Marla's name flashed on the screen. "Everything's in place," Marla said with a sense of finality. "They'll have 14 days. Lydia glanced at the clock, her gaze steady. "Then we wait." And as the evening drew closer, Lydia knew the game was already won. She would deliver the blow when it mattered most. Lydia sat at the kitchen table, the silence of the house wrapping itself around her like a familiar cloak. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, the quiet punctuated by the occasional creak of the house settling. Her hand rested on the phone, which sat, still and waiting, beside her half-empty teacup. The screen flashed a familiar number. Marla. She didn't answer. The waiting was part of the plan, part of the tension that Lydia had carefully built. She had sent the notice. Marla had done her part. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to do, except wait for Agnes's inevitable misstep. Lydia knew it was coming. She could feel it in the air, the tension stretching tight, ready to snap. The second notice, the one that would trigger the legal default clause, was on its way. The timeline was clear. Agnes would either face the reality of her own ignorance, or she wouldn't. Lydia was ready for either. A few hours later, as the sky darkened to a deep indigo, a knock came at the door. The sound echoed through the house, sharp against the quiet. Lydia's eyes flicked toward the window. She could see the glow of headlights in the driveway, a car parked just outside, its engine still idling. She didn't move right away. Instead, she sat back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of the now empty teacup. The knock came again, louder this time, insistent. Lydia rose, the movement smooth and unhurried. She opened the door just a crack, her gaze scanning the porch. Standing on the threshold, hands clasped in front of her like some kind of innocent offering, was Agnes. Her face was a mask of practiced warmth, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of desperation, a hint of something Lydia recognized all too well: fear. Agnes held out a pie, still warm from the oven, the crust golden and perfectly browned. Her voice was sweet, too sweet. "I thought I'd come by. I made this for you, just as a, well, just as a gesture. You know, after all the business with the loan, I didn't mean for things to get so messy." Lydia didn't take the pie. She didn't invite Agnes inside. Instead, she stood there, still as stone, her expression unreadable. "Thanks," Lydia said, her voice a quiet thread. "But I'm not hungry." Agnes blinked, then forced a laugh, her smile tight and strained. Of course, I just thought, well, you know, it's been a lot. I just wanted to clear the air." Lydia said nothing, but the tension in the air was thick. Agnes shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to leave. The silence stretched, the weight of it settling between them. Finally, Agnes cleared her throat, her voice rising in pitch just a little. "I mean, I didn't know you'd," she faltered. "I didn't know you'd do something like this. It's just a loan, Lydia. Just a little paper." Lydia's eyes narrowed, the familiar calm settling over her again, like a second skin. She folded her arms across her chest, standing a little straighter. "You mocked me, and now you're surprised?" Her voice was even, the words deliberate. Agnes's expression twisted into something that could have been anger or frustration, but it quickly smoothed over. She was too practiced at hiding what she didn't want anyone to see. "You blindsided me," she said, her tone sharper now, a crack in the veneer of false warmth. "I didn't think it would go this far. This is just paper, Lydia." Lydia's lips curled ever so slightly at the edges, a quiet acknowledgement of how far things had come. "So is your toast," she said, the words cutting clean and precise. For a moment, Agnes didn't speak. She just stood there, the pie still clutched in her hands, the distance between them growing heavier with every passing second. Lydia could see the panic creeping into her niece's eyes now, the way her composure was slipping, like sand falling through fingers. Lydia didn't move. She didn't offer comfort or apology. She had already said what needed to be said. Her gaze, steady and unmoving, locked onto Agnes, watching the storm of emotions play out behind her eyes. "I don't want this to tear the family apart," Agnes said after a long pause, the words coming out too quickly, as if trying to convince herself more than Lydia. Lydia took a deep breath, her chest steady. "You didn't care when you tore me apart," she said, the words almost a whisper, but they landed with the weight of a hammer. "And now you're here, pretending it was all just a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. This is the price of your entitlement, Agnes." Agnes shook her head, as though trying to dispel the truth Lydia had just dropped at her feet. "I don't know what you want me to do," she said, her voice quivering slightly now, the cracks deepening. "You've already won, haven't you? There's nothing I can do." Lydia stood there in the doorway, the evening air brushing cool against her skin. "No," she said softly. "This isn't about winning, Agnes. It's about you learning something you should have learned long ago." Agnes opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing left to say. Lydia watched her niece for a long moment, her expression unwavering, before she stepped back and quietly closed the door. The lock clicked softly into place, sealing out the confusion, the noise, and the last desperate attempt at negotiation. Lydia didn't turn away from the door. She stood there, just for a moment, listening to the sound of Agnes's car starting up in the driveway. The engine revved and faded as it pulled away, but Lydia stayed still. Every muscle in her body taut with purpose. She wasn't done yet. The storm was still coming, and Agnes had no idea how close it was. The quiet hum of the old office filled the air as Lydia sat across from Marla, her fingers lightly tapping on the smooth surface of the wooden desk. She didn't need to speak first. She had been waiting for this moment, anticipating every beat of it. When Marla's eyes finally met hers, Lydia didn't wait for the formalities. "Continue, don't delay," Lydia said, her voice calm, resolute. It was the same tone she had used when making decisions that mattered, when there was no room for second-guessing. Marla nodded, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. She flipped open a file with practiced precision, the rustling of paper breaking the stillness of the room. "We can file a lien on the house by Monday," she said, matter-of-factly, as if the decision was already made, as though it was as simple as signing a name. Lydia didn't flinch. She had made her peace with this. "Good. Let's make it public." A smile tugged at the corner of Marla's mouth, but there was no warmth in it. "You've got it." As the lawyer jotted something down in her notes, Lydia allowed herself a brief moment to think. She wasn't angry anymore. She didn't feel much of anything except clarity. For years, Agnes had pretended to be someone she wasn't, pretended to be better than Lydia, better than their family, their history, their struggles. But now the balance was shifting. "What are you keeping?" Ruth's voice came to her then, echoing in the back of her mind. The words had come on a quiet afternoon when Lydia had been staring out the window, thinking about everything Agnes had taken from her. Lydia's reply had been simple then, and it still was now. "My dignity. That's all I needed back." Marla signed off on a few more documents, her movements quick, professional. She didn't need to ask Lydia if she was sure. There was no question about it. This was happening. Lydia rose from the chair, smoothing out her coat. The wool felt familiar on her skin, a shield in this world that had never quite understood her. "Send it, and make sure they know," Lydia said, before turning toward the door. There was no hesitation in her step, no uncertainty. The pieces were falling into place. Later, Lydia walked into the Quilted Fox Cafe, the cozy bell above the door chiming as she entered. It was quiet here, the kind of place where the world felt softer. The waitress behind the counter greeted her with a warm smile, the kind that only belonged in places like this. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cole," the waitress said, her voice a bit too chipper. "The usual?" Lydia nodded, taking a seat in the corner. She didn't need to look up to know what was happening. Agnes hadn't been here in weeks, but today was different. Lydia could feel the shift, the buzz of the room hinting at something just below the surface. The waitress brought over the tea, her smile still in place. She placed the cup down with a practiced grace, but there was something about the way she lingered that caught Lydia's attention. "Your niece was in here earlier," the waitress said, almost as an afterthought. She seemed frazzled. Lydia raised her eyebrows, her fingers curling around the warm porcelain of the teacup. She didn't let her surprise show, but something inside her stirred. She could picture Agnes now, hastily scribbling a letter, a veneer of innocence, but panic simmering beneath it. "She didn't say much," the waitress continued, picking up the empty cup from another table. "But she didn't seem like herself. Kind of off balance." Lydia kept her gaze on the cup in front of her, swirling the tea gently. "Of course," she murmured, her voice soft but unwavering. Agnes, always so sure of herself, had been thrown off. The weight of it all was catching up to her. The waitress smiled again, not knowing the full story. But Lydia knew. She could feel the edges of Agnes's carefully constructed world starting to fray. Every lie, every ounce of entitlement was starting to crack. But there was no rush, no need for haste. The storm had already begun. As Lydia sat in the warmth of the cafe, sipping her tea, she felt the pieces aligning. Slowly, inevitably. Agnes's time was running out. She could feel it in the way the air had shifted today. The house would be gone, the debts would come due. The world Agnes had built would crumble under the weight of its own facade. But for now, Lydia would wait. The quiet before the storm was always the longest. The morning was still thick with fog as Lydia sat in her kitchen, the quiet of the house wrapping around her like a protective barrier. Her hand moved across the smooth surface of the table, brushing away a few crumbs from her breakfast. She wasn't distracted. She didn't need to be. She could feel the ripples starting, the subtle shift in the air, like the first tremors of a storm. The phone rang. Lydia didn't hesitate. She knew exactly who it was before she even looked at the screen. Lydia. Ruth's voice came through, direct and low. It's out. Lydia exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. She wasn't surprised. She'd known this moment would come. She had watched the pieces fall into place, one after the other, and now, the truth had found its way to the public. Who? Lydia asked, her voice neutral. Local blogger, Ruth said, her tone clipped but with an edge of satisfaction. Picked up the lean filing. Words already spreading. Lydia's lips curled into a faint smile. She could already picture it. Oak Ridge, with its tight-knit, gossipy circles, buzzing with rumors and half-truths. The whispers had begun. She could hear them now, soft and insistent in her mind, carried on the breeze that had just started to stir outside. Is Agnes in debt? They'd ask. What's going on with the Lawson estate? The walls of Agnes's perfectly curated world were beginning to crack, and Lydia was just a quiet observer, watching it all unfold. Lydia didn't respond right away, the quiet satisfaction of the moment settling inside her. Ruth's voice broke the stillness, pulling her back into the present. She won't be able to hide this, Lydia, Ruth said, as if confirming what Lydia already knew. Not for long. No, Lydia replied softly. She won't. By mid-afternoon, the Oak Ridge whispers had escalated into full-blown questions, and Lydia could feel it. The stares, the hushed conversations. It was almost like a quiet roar. The kind of sound you couldn't hear directly, but you could feel deep in your bones. Agnes was no longer the darling of their social circle. She was the subject of something far less flattering. Lydia didn't bother to walk into the center of it. She didn't need to. She had her own place, her own purpose now. She sat on the porch of her house, the soft rustling of the wind through the trees almost like a companion as she sipped her tea. The doorbell rang, a jarring sound that broke the peace she'd cultivated all morning. Lydia stood, the motion fluid, and made her way to the door. She opened it without hesitation, and there, standing on the other side, was Millie, Agnes's daughter, looking hesitant, her hands clutching her purse. Lydia raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. Millie was a quiet girl, too often caught between the pull of her mother's world and the softness of her own heart. Hi, Aunt Lydia, Millie said quietly, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I wanted to ask you something. Lydia closed the door behind her but said nothing, waiting for Millie to continue. Millie hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously around the strap of her bag. Why is Mom so angry? Why is she acting like this? The question hung between them, fragile and full of unspoken emotions. Lydia studied her niece for a long moment, her face unreadable. Because, Lydia said softly, her voice almost a whisper, what's fair looks like revenge to the entitled. Millie's brow furrowed, confusion evident in her eyes. She didn't understand. She wouldn't. Not yet. Lydia didn't want her to. Not now. But one day she would. She was certain of it. One day Millie would understand the cost of everything Agnes had claimed for herself. Lydia stood for a moment in the quiet between them before reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a check, writing the amount with careful precision, not glancing up. Millie took a few hesitant steps forward, her eyes drawn to the check in Lydia's hand. "What's this?" she asked, her voice unsure, still caught in the web of family tension. "For you," Lydia said, placing the check in Millie's hands, her fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "Art camp. I know you've wanted to go." Millie's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "But, Mom," she started, but Lydia raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't mention your mother," Lydia said firmly, her voice gentle but final. "This is for you. You deserve it. Don't let anyone take that from you." Millie's fingers tightened around the check, the edges of it trembling slightly as she looked at her aunt. She opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again, words failing her. She wasn't ready to understand, not yet. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice small but full of something Lydia couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or something like it. Lydia nodded once, the gesture calm and composed. "Go. Make something of yourself, Millie. That's all I'm asking." Millie turned toward the door, clutching the check in her hand. She paused before opening it, her hand resting on the doorknob for a moment, her back to Lydia. "I'll go," Millie said softly, before stepping out into the quiet afternoon. The door closed behind her, and Lydia stood alone in the stillness. The storm was getting closer, but this small victory, this simple gesture for Millie, felt like a quiet reprieve, a small piece of peace before the final wave hit. Lydia didn't look back at the door. She simply turned, her eyes settling on the horizon beyond the porch. The world was changing, and she was ready to see how it all played out. The pieces were in motion, and there was no turning back now. The Oak Ridge Country Club was more lavish than Lydia remembered, the room gleaming under the soft golden light of chandeliers, the polished floors reflecting the carefully curated chaos of a social event. But tonight, the buzz wasn't the same. It had shifted, a quiet undercurrent running through the crowd, almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore. Lydia could feel it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath, the way eyes flicked over her and quickly looked away, as though they were trying to place her, trying to remember if she belonged here. When she entered the ballroom, she was directed toward a table that had been set with an almost reverent air, the seat beside the club director waiting for her. The woman guiding her didn't speak, but the glance she shared with the other staff made it clear. This was a seat of distinction. Lydia, for once, wasn't at the edge of the room. She wasn't a shadow. She wasn't invisible. Her fingers brushed the back of the chair as she sat, her coat falling softly behind her, her old, hand-stitched wool coat. It hung quietly, warmly, as if it had always belonged there. Its presence at this table felt like a challenge to the world of Oak Ridge, as though the coat had taken root here without asking for permission, without needing to explain itself. The voices around her buzzed fragmented snippets of conversation, but Lydia didn't engage. She was comfortable in the stillness, in the weight of being seen and not seen all at once. She sipped her water, the cool glass refreshing against the rising heat of the room. Every now and then someone would glance her way, recognition flickering, followed by a return to their drinks, their conversations. Then the microphone hummed, the chatter in the room dipping as the event organizer stepped up to the stage, smiling with practiced ease. The introduction was short, perfunctory, but then her voice rose and the crowd stilled. "We are so grateful to Lydia Cole," the organizer said, her voice ringing clear, "for her generous donation to the Student Artists Fund. Let's give her a round of applause." Lydia's eyes barely lifted from her glass. She could feel the weight of the room turning toward her, the polite clapping echoing against her ears. But the words didn't mean much. The thank you wasn't for her generosity. It was for the status of the donation. They were celebrating what the donation represented, not who Lydia was or how she had chosen to give. Still, she smiled, small and composed. That was enough. From across the room, Lydia saw Agnes enter. Her entrance was unmistakable, all sharp edges and forced brightness, like a show she had to put on. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, her smile faltering as it landed on Lydia. The briefest flicker of tension passed between them before Agnes's gaze shifted to the room at large. She didn't approach. Not yet. But Lydia could feel her presence, could feel the ripple of discomfort that followed Agnes's arrival. Agnes, despite everything, still walked with the same air of authority, but it was thinner now, like the paper-thin veneer of a figure who had been revealed. She was barely greeted, a small nod here and there, people looking past her as if they weren't sure where to place her in this new world that Lydia was quietly, methodically reshaping. Lydia didn't react. Her coat was draped behind her, its fabric falling over the chair, a soft presence that anchored her to this new position in the room. No one dared to ask her to move, and no one questioned her seat. At some point during the evening, a board member, someone Lydia had never met but whose name seemed important, leaned in toward her. There was a curious gleam in his eyes, something between politeness and intrigue. "Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice low as though speaking through a veil of respect, "I hope you'll consider joining next year's event committee. We could use someone with your eye for art. Your taste, it seems, is impeccable." Lydia raised her eyebrows just slightly, a quiet smile playing at the edge of her lips. It wasn't a genuine compliment. It never was. He didn't care about her taste or her art. He was seeing her now because of her name, because of the donation, because of the power that came with the seat she now occupied. She didn't immediately respond. She sipped her water, letting the pause linger. "Let me check my quilting schedule," she said finally, her voice just loud enough for him to hear, the words a deliberate undercurrent of coolness. It was a polite refusal, but it was layered with a truth only the two of them understood. He was asking because he saw the power she held now, not because he had any interest in her work or her opinions. The man blinked, unsure whether to laugh or apologize, but Lydia had already turned her attention back to the crowd. The moment was over for him, and the power had shifted back into her hands. Agnes, who had been watching from across the room, was now visibly fidgeting. Her smile had long since faded, replaced with something sharper, something more brittle. She had underestimated Lydia, had thought her small, unimportant. But Lydia was a quiet force, a constant ripple that slowly eroded everything Agnes had built. Lydia remained seated, the coat behind her like a shield, her calm unshakable. Agnes's world was crumbling, and Lydia, quiet, composed, was simply watching it unfold. The seat at the table, the one that Agnes had always coveted, was now Lydia's by right. And no one, not even Agnes, could take that away. The storm, Lydia knew, was only just beginning. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, its screen glowing in the soft, late afternoon light. Lydia glanced at it once as it buzzed again, but she didn't pick it up. She had no need to. The message was simple. Agnes, frantic, pleading for an answer, for some acknowledgement of the storm she had unwittingly invited into her life. But Lydia didn't respond. She didn't need to. The message blinked silently on the screen, a symbol of Agnes's desperation. She was trying, once again, to cling to the illusion of control, to make one final attempt at negotiating her way out of the hole she had dug. But Lydia wasn't playing that game anymore. She had already made her move. Marla was already handling the legal proceedings. The foreclosure notices had been filed. The time for negotiation had long passed. Agnes had played the part of the entitled, the victim of some unseen conspiracy. But now, the reality was settling in. Agnes was about to learn that nothing, not even her name, could shield her from the consequences of her choices. Lydia didn't rush to call Marla. She knew the process was already set in motion, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that it was now irreversible. Marla's voice was calm when Lydia finally picked up the phone. "We're moving ahead with the foreclosure," Marla said, her tone clipped. "I've also taken the liberty of blocking the title transfer to Calvin. The court order's in place." Lydia didn't need any more details. She trusted Marla to handle the legalities, to do the things Lydia knew she could never bring herself to do. She didn't need to be cruel. She didn't need to make Agnes's downfall personal. The law would do the work for her. "Good," Lydia replied, her voice steady. "Keep me updated." The conversation ended, but Lydia didn't feel the rush of victory. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching the pieces fall into place, a calm certainty in the fact that Agnes's world had been irrevocably altered. The finality was what mattered. The long, patient wait was over. Lydia turned to the small desk in the corner of her study, where her own estate plan lay open. Her fingers hovered over the pages, a steady hand, as she began making the changes she'd been considering for months. Agnes and Calvin, both removed. It wasn't out of malice, but out of necessity. Their positions had long since been marked with the stain of betrayal. They had shown no gratitude for Lydia's help, no understanding of the sacrifices she had made. Their names had to be struck through. The real change came when she added Millie's name, quietly, without ceremony. Millie was a reminder of what could have been, a reminder of the family that might have been. Lydia paused for a moment as she wrote out the conditions of Millie's inheritance. She would only inherit once she reached 18, once she had been legally emancipated. It was a safeguard, a silent protection. Millie would never have to carry the weight of her mother's choices, not if Lydia could help it. She sat back in her chair, looking at the document before her. For the first time in years, the future seemed clear. The pieces had been rearranged. The past was no longer her burden to bear. The phone buzzed again. Another message from Agnes. Lydia didn't even look at the screen this time. Across the room, Ruth's voice echoed in her mind from the days when things had felt uncertain. "Justice looks good on you," Ruth had said with a knowing smile. Lydia couldn't help but smile back now. Her fingers trailed over the edge of the paper, the weight of it comforting. The past was now a thing of the past. The world that Agnes had worked so hard to build, based on lies, on illusion, was collapsing, and Lydia was the one who had set it in motion. "It fits better than silk," Lydia whispered to the quiet room. Her coat, the old hand-stitched wool that had been so easily dismissed, hung in the corner behind her. A silent testament to everything Agnes had underestimated. It was still there, still intact, still standing tall in a way Agnes never could. And now, as Lydia looked out the window at the slowly darkening sky, she realized something. The storm had passed. The world Agnes had made for herself, the one she'd held so tightly to, was gone. And Lydia, quiet, composed, unnoticed, was still standing. The calm after the storm was often the most dangerous time, and Lydia was finally ready to see it all unfold. The final chapter was just beginning. The phone call came like a final punctuation mark to the long, drawn-out drama. Lydia had known it was coming. but it didn't make the weight of it any lighter. The sale of the Lawson estate was set. The papers had been drawn up, but a wrinkle had appeared. Lydia's legal share had to be cleared first. It was a formality, but it was one that would stretch things out, at least for a little while longer. The estate was worth millions. The house alone had been the pride of Oak Ridge, an architectural masterpiece nestled among the sprawling acres, but Lydia had made sure the lien she placed on it wouldn't be so easily ignored. She knew the power of patience, and this wasn't the time to show mercy. A quiet sense of satisfaction settled in her chest as she opened the document in front of her, the weight of the legal jargon comforting in its formality. A steady hand wrote the final clause, a small but calculated price for Agnes's ignorance. Lydia leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the soft light filtering through the trees. It was almost too perfect. This was the way things should have been all along. The phone buzzed again. She picked it up without hesitation. Marla's voice was crisp. "The sale's stalling. Your legal share has to be cleared first. They can't proceed without it." Lydia's lips barely moved as she exhaled. She had been prepared for this. It was the perfect stall tactic. The more time that passed, the more pressure Agnes would feel. "Don't worry," Lydia said, her tone even. "Send them the buyout offer. Make it fair, firm, public." "Got it," Marla replied. Lydia knew exactly how this was going to play out. She had already seen the steps in her mind, the moves unfolding like a carefully orchestrated symphony. Agnes wouldn't be able to match the buyout. The estate was too far gone. The lien would make it impossible for any bank to offer a loan, and when it came down to the final offer, Lydia would be in a position to take control. The weeks passed, the whispers of the foreclosure growing louder, but still, Agnes refused to acknowledge it. The offer Lydia had set was generous in its fairness, and the buyout price was carefully calculated. Agnes's pride wouldn't let her accept it. Lydia knew that. By the time the final offer came, Lydia was sitting in the same spot, at the old wooden table in the quiet of her home. She could see everything, the estate that Agnes had clung to, the illusion of power that had slipped away with each passing day. Lydia took the call herself this time. It was better to hear it from the source. "Lydia." Agnes's voice was tight, strained, but still carrying the same sharp edge. "You think you can just take everything from me? You think this is the solution?" Lydia paused, letting the silence stretch between them. She knew Agnes wouldn't understand, and she wasn't going to explain. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. "I'm offering you a way out, Agnes," Lydia said, her voice calm, almost serene. "A way to save face." There was a long pause. "I'll never accept your handout," Agnes snapped. "You've already ruined me. You're taking everything I've worked for. The estate, the reputation, everything. If you want it so badly, take it. I won't fight anymore." Lydia's lips pressed together in a thin line, but she remained calm. Agnes was not going to win this fight. The power had already shifted. "You don't understand," Agnes continued, her voice growing more erratic. "You're destroying everything. You'd ruin our name. You'd drag us through the mud." Lydia closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the sound of Agnes's anger, the frustration that Lydia had worked so carefully to draw out. It was the sound of someone on the edge, realizing they had lost everything they thought they could control. "No, dear," Lydia said softly, her voice quiet but firm. "I'd correct it." The words hung in the air, cutting through the noise. Agnes's anger faltered for just a moment. She had no retort. The moment had passed, and Lydia had won. Lydia hung up the phone with a finality that felt almost surreal. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She simply felt the weight of it, the weight of everything that had led her here. And now, with Agnes left to face the consequences of her actions, Lydia knew there would be no going back. The house, the estate, The image Agnes had spent years building, all of it was slipping away. And Lydia? She remained, quiet and composed, in a world that she had quietly, steadily reshaped. There was no more waiting. The final chapter was here. Lydia turned her gaze toward the window once again, the evening light slipping slowly into darkness. It was over. The pen felt heavier than it should have as Lydia held it over the deed, the paper crisp under her fingertips. The room was quiet, save for the distant hum of the clock ticking away in the corner. She had read the document several times already, but each word seemed to land differently now that it was real. The ink would dry and her name would be on the title. Alone. No co-signers. No complications. No pretenses. Her fingers didn't tremble, but her thoughts lingered just for a moment longer on the past, the years of supporting Agnes, the quiet sacrifices, the way Lydia had always been the one who stood in the background, unseen until now. She had held everything together, while Agnes had flung everything apart in a desperate grasp for something she could never truly own. Lydia exhaled, then signed the deed with a steady hand. The weight of her own signature was both liberating and final, the smooth curve of each letter a quiet declaration. Lydia Cole. The name stood there alone, unwavering, in black ink. No more reminders of what had been. No more shadows of a past that had nearly consumed her. The paper was folded and sealed, the deed now officially hers. The property, the house, the legacy. It was all hers. Her thoughts shifted, and for the briefest moment there was no tension, no conflict. There was only the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had taken back control. She had restored order to a world that had long since lost it. By the time Ruth arrived, Lydia was sitting in the same chair, the deed in her hands. Ruth entered with a knowing smile, her eyes bright with the kind of satisfaction that only someone who had witnessed the entire journey could have. "I brought champagne," Ruth said, lifting the bottle with a flourish. Lydia's smile was small, but it was there. "I'll pass," she said gently. "I'm having herbal tea." Ruth raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She poured herself a glass and sat across from Lydia, the crystal flute catching the light. There was a pause as Ruth studied her, almost as if searching for a sign of the relief that should have come with the finality of it all. Instead, Lydia took a sip of her tea, the warmth of it grounding her. "It's done," she said simply, her voice a quiet hum. Ruth's eyes softened and she nodded, lifting her glass in a silent toast. "To justice, then." Lydia's smile widened, her eyes glinting with a quiet acknowledgement. "To clarity," she replied, her voice steady, almost serene. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the occasion settling around them. Ruth took a sip of her champagne, the bubbles dancing, while Lydia sipped her tea, both of them silently acknowledging the space they now inhabited. The storm had passed. The house was hers. The debts were cleared, and Agnes's empire was nothing but dust. Later that evening, Lydia stood in the hallway of the Lawson estate, her fingers grazing the polished wood of the railing she had helped pay for. The house was empty now, devoid of the chaos and superficial grandeur that Agnes had once filled it with. The echoes of parties, of laughter, of power, all of it was gone. The silence was heavier here than it had been at home, a quiet that seemed to fill every corner, every room. She ran her hand along the railing, its surface smooth under her fingertips, and she couldn't help but smile. The railing had been a part of the vision, one of the things Lydia had fought for all those years. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was hers. Her quiet mark on a house that would never again belong to the woman who had tried to erase her. The emptiness was final, but it was also freeing. As Lydia stood there, the stillness of the house surrounding her, the sound of her footsteps echoed in the grand hall. She made her way to the mailbox at the end of the drive, a quiet intention behind her every step. There, tucked inside, was a note. It was small, folded neatly, the handwriting unmistakable. "I'm sorry, you didn't deserve it." Lydia's heart gave a strange, almost imperceptible lurch, but she didn't let it show. Millie had written the note. Of course she had. The girl had always been caught in the middle, too innocent to understand the weight of what was happening. Lydia folded the note in half, her fingers holding it gently. She knew Millie would never fully grasp the depth of the situation, but she could still offer her something. Something that had been lost in the chaos of her mother's world. Lydia took the note back inside and, with deliberate care, placed it in an envelope. She pulled out an old family photo, one of Millie when she was just a little girl, laughing in the garden with Agnes. It had been a simpler time, before everything fell apart. Lydia added her phone number at the bottom of the card, her handwriting calm and neat. She sealed the envelope and wrote Millie's name on the front. It was the last piece of this puzzle that Lydia needed to complete. Millie needed a lifeline, something real, a future that wasn't tainted by the chaos of her mother's mistakes. Lydia sat back down at the desk, the pen in her hand steady as she made the final changes to her will. Her gaze flicked over the document as she reviewed it one last time. Agnes and Calvin were gone. Millie's name was now the one that carried hope. Lydia put the pen down and leaned back in her chair. The house, the estate, the future. It was all hers to shape now. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, and the weight of it felt lighter than ever. But as she sat there in the quiet, she knew the storm wasn't truly over. This was just the beginning of something else entirely. The final chapter had closed on one world, but another, one of her making, was waiting to be written. Lydia sat in front of the mirror, her reflection calm, composed, and steady. The interview would take place in a matter of hours, but she didn't feel any of the nerves that most people might. This wasn't the moment for theatrics, for dramatizing what had happened. No, Lydia had never been the one to play into drama. The truth, simple and plain, was her weapon now. She would tell her story, but not to gain sympathy. She had no need for that. She had nothing to prove. A quiet knock at the door broke the stillness of the room. Ruth, as always, appeared in the doorway, a knowing look on her face. "Are you ready for this?" Lydia smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the fabric of her coat, a silent comfort in the way it had always been. "I'm ready," she said softly. She adjusted the collar of her coat before standing, her movements deliberate but not rushed. There was no hesitation. The time for hiding had long passed. Ruth stepped aside to let Lydia pass. The two of them moved through the house, out to the car waiting outside. The interview wouldn't be in a grand office, but at the quiet end of a cafe in town. Lydia wasn't interested in the spotlight. She wasn't interested in playing games. She would simply tell the truth. The truth, Lydia knew, was enough. The cafe was modest, with worn wood floors and the faint scent of old books. The journalist, a young woman named Claire, stood when Lydia walked in, her eyes wide with something Lydia couldn't quite place. Perhaps awe, perhaps curiosity. Lydia nodded politely and sat across from her, placing her coat over the back of the chair. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Claire said, her voice warm but professional. She shifted the papers in front of her, making small talk for a moment before launching into her questions. "Let's start with the basics. You've been the center of a lot of attention lately, especially with the loss of the Lawson estate." Lydia's gaze didn't falter. She had already prepared for this. "Yes, I've been part of the estate for a long time. I co-signed a loan years ago, and when things fell apart, I chose to do what was necessary." "And that included stepping into a very public role," Claire prompted, her pen poised above the page. "You've been praised by some, but also criticized for the way you handled it. What do you say to that?" Lydia's smile remained small, composed. "I say it was necessary. There's a difference between generosity and enabling. When people think their actions have no consequences, it's important that someone holds them accountable. I wasn't out for revenge. I was out for what was right." Claire scribbled something down. And was it hard? To take everything from Agnes Lawson? Lydia shook her head slightly, her eyes steady. It wasn't about taking anything. It was about restoring what had been lost. I held up my end of things for a long time. I carried the weight of others' decisions for far too long. It was time for that weight to shift. There was no drama in Lydia's words, no sweeping emotion. She wasn't here to make people feel pity or admiration. She simply told the truth, plain and factual. "Do you think Agnes understands that?" Claire asked after a moment of silence. Lydia paused, her gaze softening for the briefest moment. "I don't think she ever will. Not fully, but she doesn't have to. I did what needed to be done." The interview went on, the questions and answers flowing like a quiet river, steady and calm. By the end of it, Lydia felt the weight of the story lifting off her shoulders. She had told her truth, the one no one had bothered to listen to for years. A few days later, the headline appeared in the paper. "Mocked for her coat." She held the deed. It was simple, understated, but in those words, Lydia saw everything she had been fighting for. No embellishments, no drama, just the facts. The article spread quickly, whispers traveling faster than expected. Lydia received messages from strangers, thank you notes from people who had never known her, but who now understood what had happened. It wasn't the gratitude she had been seeking. It wasn't the recognition, but it was enough. Enough to know that the truth had finally been shared, had finally been heard. A few days later, Lydia received an unexpected call from the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a board member, someone she had never met but whose name had become familiar in recent weeks. "We've been discussing the future of the event committees," the voice said, "and we'd like to offer you a place, your vision, your approach. It's exactly what we need going forward." Lydia's lips curled into a faint smile. "Let me check my quilting schedule." Later that evening, Ruth stopped by, holding a bottle of champagne. "This feels like a victory," she said, glancing at Lydia, her eyes full of pride. Lydia nodded, but her smile remained calm. "Justice looks good on you," Ruth said, as though the words belonged more to Lydia than anyone else. Lydia's fingers brushed the fabric of her coat, the coat that had once been the symbol of mockery, now the symbol of something stronger. "And some wear wool," Lydia replied softly. The words were quiet, but in them there was power. Power in knowing that, through everything, she had remained composed. Lydia had won, but it was a victory that wasn't measured by others' praise. It was measured by the peace she felt now, the peace that came from simply owning her truth. She was finally free, and that was enough. Lydia sat at her kitchen table, a stack of paperwork before her. The room was quiet, save for the soft tick of the clock and the rustle of the pages. She had a purpose today, a quiet, final act she'd planned carefully, almost with a mother's tenderness. It was a gesture that, like everything else she had done, would go unnoticed by most. But to Millie, it would mean something far deeper. It would be a lifeline in the chaos of her fractured world. Lydia clicked the pen and signed a document. The first tuition installment for Millie's college fund. Lydia had never been the one to announce grand gestures, to demand recognition for her actions. She was simply doing what needed to be done. The transfer was anonymous. There would be no fanfare, no gratitude expected, no name attached. Just a simple, quiet act that would help Millie. The girl, caught in the crossfire of her parents' failures, deserved something different, a future unburdened by the weight of Agnes's mistakes. Lydia's fingers lingered on the pen as she made the final entry on the form. Millie Cole, conditioned upon emancipation at age 21. Lydia took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling into her chest. It wasn't about being kind to Agnes or Calvin. It wasn't about rescuing Millie. It was simply about offering the girl the possibility of something more. A future that wasn't tangled in the mess of her mother's broken ambitions. A few weeks later, the news made its way back to Lydia. She was in her studio, her hands deftly stitching the pattern of a new quilt. Her fingers moved with the rhythm of years of practice, steady and confident, the soft hum of the needle pulling fabric together. It was familiar, comfortable. The phone rang, and Lydia knew before she picked it up that it was from an unknown number. She let it ring twice before answering. Yes? Her voice was calm, no sign of surprise. The voice on the other end was sharp, tinged with something less than polite. I know you did it, Lydia. You paid for Millie's tuition. You think you're some kind of hero now? Lydia sat back in her chair, her fingers stilling on the fabric. The silence between them felt thick. She had known it would come, had known Agnes would discover what she had done. It's done, Lydia said, her voice even, unwavering. That's all that matters. Agnes's voice cracked, her control slipping. You think you've won? You think you've fixed everything with some money? What are you doing? You think this will make up for what you've taken from me? Lydia's eyes glanced toward the window, the soft light from outside making the room feel distant, almost surreal. The conflict that had once consumed her felt so far away now, like a storm cloud retreating into the distance. I'm not trying to fix anything, Agnes, Lydia said calmly. I'm trying to give Millie a chance. That's all. There was a long pause, and then Agnes's words came in a bitter rush. You've humiliated me enough. You think this is going to make me forgive you? I'm not asking for forgiveness, Lydia replied softly. I'm just doing what's right. The line went silent, the anger hanging there, unresolved. Lydia could feel the way the conversation had ended, the unfinished thread of it. But she had already moved on. She had done what needed to be done. The next day, Lydia walked into her local auction house with a bundle of quilts under her arm, each piece carefully crafted, stitched with the quiet love she had put into every detail of her life. She placed the first quilt on display, its soft colors catching the light as it was draped across the table. It was a beautiful piece, one that she had made during the last few months of Agnes's reign over the estate. A symbol of her own quiet resilience. The auctioneer took a quick glance at the piece before nodding in approval. This will go fast, he said, his voice professional, disinterested. He had no idea what it represented. Lydia didn't need him to. She didn't need anyone to understand the significance of the quilt. The proceeds from the sale would go to the Student Artists Fund she had quietly supported for years. It wasn't about the recognition. It was about restoring balance, just as she had done with Millie's future. That evening, Ruth arrived with a bottle of wine. She uncorked it with a flourish and poured 2 glasses, one for each of them. The room was calm, the soft light of evening spilling across the floor. Ruth looked over at Lydia, a knowing smile on her face. You gave them more than they gave you, Ruth said, her voice low but full of meaning. Lydia glanced down at her hands, still holding the glass, and the quilted fabric in the corner of her studio. I didn't do it for them, Lydia replied. I did it because Millie deserves something better than what she's been handed. Ruth studied her, the words hanging between them. You know, justice looks good on you. Lydia smiled softly, the corners of her lips barely curling. And some wear wool, she said, the words quiet but full of meaning. They clinked their glasses together, the sound of the toast hanging in the air. Lydia didn't need anything more than this: the quiet, the peace, the knowledge that she had finally reclaimed her life and helped someone else find their own way. The battle was over, but the work, Lydia's quiet, steady work, was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Lydia knew she was on the right path. The coat lay folded neatly on the chair in Lydia's study, its woolen fabric soft with age, worn in places but still resilient. It had been a part of her for so long now, through every quiet battle, every silent sacrifice. The coat had witnessed her life from a distance, a shield against the world's judgment, yet also a reminder of everything she had carried for far too long. Agnes had mocked it, but Lydia knew it for what it was: a symbol of quiet endurance. Lydia ran her fingers along the fabric, the familiar weave grounding her in this moment. It wasn't just any coat. It had seen her through the years when she'd kept quiet, when she'd kept her head down and her heart hidden. It had borne the weight of debts long unpaid, promises unfulfilled. The coat had carried it all, silently. She moved toward the laundry room, where the delicate hum of the washing machine was a gentle reminder of how much she had washed away in her own life. The coat needed care now, needed to be tended to. She placed it in the dry cleaning bag and let the gentle swish of fabric accompany her to the shop. The attendant at the dry cleaners didn't ask any questions, just nodded as Lydia handed over the bag with the coat. Lydia smiled quietly, not saying much as she left the shop. It wasn't about the coat being cleaned. It was about what she had to do next. Hours later, Lydia stood in front of the chair where the coat had once sat. The wool was fresh now, soft and clean. She laid it flat on the table, smoothing out the wrinkles with her hands, feeling the quiet weight of everything that had happened. The loan papers, crinkled and faded with time, were placed gently back inside the coat's deep pockets. The papers had been a burden for far too long. They had been hidden for years, hidden in the coat's pockets, tucked away in a place where only Lydia knew where to look. They were no longer necessary. Everything had changed, but they still held power. And as much as she had done to change the course of her life, she needed to finish this. She took the pen and wrote a note. Her hand, steady as it had always been, formed the simple words. This held every debt you forgot. It was a quiet message, a statement that said everything it needed to say, without much fanfare. Agnes would never see it, but Lydia didn't need her to. This was for Lydia, an acknowledgement of everything she had been through, and of everything she had endured. Lydia folded the note carefully and slipped it into the pocket with the papers. She sat back, taking in the sight of the coat one last time. It had been the symbol of her humility, of her restraint, of her quiet presence in a world that had overlooked her for so long. Now, it would be something different. The next day, Lydia stood in front of the local museum, a place that had long represented the things she valued: the history, the stories that lived within objects, the quiet power of things that had withstood time. She walked through the entrance, the familiar smell of polished wood and old fabric filling her senses. The coat was placed carefully in the exhibit, just as Lydia had envisioned. She stepped back to admire it, its simple elegance, its quiet presence among the other artifacts. The title card beside it read, "A Woman's Old Coat and a Family's Final Lesson." The words felt heavier than she had imagined. The coat, now displayed for the world to see, told a story of endurance and sacrifice. It was no longer a forgotten thing hidden away. It had a place in history now, a place where others could understand its power, its meaning. And it wasn't just a coat anymore. It was a symbol of all the things Agnes had overlooked, of all the things Lydia had quietly carried. Lydia stood there for a moment, taking it in. The silence of the museum felt like a quiet confirmation, like the weight of everything was being acknowledged in this small, simple gesture. When Lydia left the museum, she walked with the same steady pace, but there was something lighter about her. The past, the debts, the years of quiet waiting, they were all behind her now. The future stretched out in front of her, open and unburdened. As she passed the door to the museum, a small group of people gathered around the exhibit, admiring the coat. Their whispers were soft, respectful. Lydia didn't stop to listen. She didn't need to. The truth of the coat, of her story, was already being told in a way it never had been before. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't pull it out. Agnes's attempts to regain control, to call, to manipulate, none of it mattered anymore. What Lydia had built, quietly, steadily, couldn't be undone. For the first time in a long time, Lydia felt restored. Not vindicated, not from revenge or from punishment, but restored, as if she had finally reclaimed the parts of herself she had long neglected. She had made her peace with the past. And now, the future was hers. As she walked home, the cool evening air brushing her skin, she realized something. This wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The past had its lessons. The present had its peace. But the future? The future was hers to shape. And that, in the end, was the true power. The house was still, the light from the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Lydia sat at her kitchen table, the same table where so many quiet decisions had been made. The remnants of their tea, steaming and calm, sat before her. The air felt different now, thicker with unspoken words, but also a sense of understanding. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where healing could begin. Millie sat across from her. The girl's eyes darkened with the weight of everything she had witnessed in her short life. Lydia saw the traces of confusion, of the difficult path Millie had been forced to walk between loyalty to her mother and the truth she had come to recognize in Lydia's steadiness. Millie wasn't a child anymore, but Lydia could see how the years had made her wise beyond her age. After a long pause, Millie's voice broke the silence, a question that had lingered between them for so long. "Why didn't you fight louder?" Millie asked, her words soft but filled with an edge of something deeper, something unresolved. Her eyes were locked on Lydia's, searching for an answer she hadn't received until now. "I saw it. The way she treated you. The way she treated all of us. Why didn't you fight back harder?" "You could have." Lydia's gaze didn't waver. Her hand moved slowly, almost unconsciously, to her cup of tea. And she took a measured sip before placing it back down on the table with a steady hand. She didn't look away from Millie, her voice calm and steady, as it had always been in moments like this. "Because the paperwork was louder than anything I could say," Lydia replied, her tone quiet but imbued with the weight of years of silence. It wasn't about shouting or making noise. It was about what was real, what could be proven. "I didn't need to fight in ways that weren't mine to fight. The truth spoke for me." Millie looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. She was quiet for a long time, her face an open book, one that Lydia could read but never fully understand. This was a conversation that would heal something deep inside them both, but the words weren't easy to come by. Lydia watched Millie, giving her space, not pressing for answers. She had learned the power of patience over the years, and Millie wasn't yet ready to speak all the truths that swirled in her mind. Finally, Millie looked back up at Lydia, her expression softer now, more open. "I think I get it," she whispered, as if she were still trying to convince herself. "I've always tried to understand, tried to make sense of it all, but I didn't see it the way you did. I didn't know it had to be like that." Lydia nodded gently. Sometimes the truth isn't the easiest path, Millie, but it's the only one that leads somewhere real. Millie took a deep breath, and there was a vulnerability in her that Lydia hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, they were just two people sitting in the same quiet room, sharing a space where the past was finally becoming something that could be understood, something that could heal. I already have, Millie said, her voice almost a whisper, but the certainty in it was unmistakable. Thanks to you. The words were like balm to Lydia's soul, a quiet affirmation of all the things she had done without asking for recognition. Millie had begun to understand not just what Lydia had done for her, but what Lydia had always done, quietly, consistently, without the need for applause. She had given Millie something real, something no one else could have. Lydia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand meeting Millie's, their fingers clasped, strong and steady. It was a simple gesture, one that said everything they both needed. It was a moment of understanding, of a bond finally forged, one that neither time nor the chaos of their shared history could break. Millie stood, her movements slow but purposeful, as though she had finally found a place for herself in the world, a place where she could stand on her own. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet field behind the estate, the same field where she had spent so many years watching the world shift around her, unsure of where she belonged. Lydia stood as well, walking quietly over to the window beside her. Together, they watched the evening sky slowly change colors, the calm before the night. You have time to grow different, Lydia said, her voice soft but firm. Don't rush it. Millie nodded, the weight of the future suddenly feeling less heavy. I will. I already am. The two of them stood side by side for a long time, watching the sky darken, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by something new between them. As they sat back down at the table, Lydia's fingers absent-mindedly stroked the fabric of her coat, the one that had come to symbolize so much more than anyone could have known. It had been mocked, ridiculed, dismissed. But in its pockets, it had held the weight of everything, the debts, the sacrifices, and the quiet truth that no one had seen until now. Lydia's lips parted in a small private smile. Her coat was no longer just a garment. It had become a story, a lesson, and a symbol of something more, something real, something that, in the end, had finally been seen for what it truly was. She mocked my old coat in front of everyone, Lydia whispered, the words slipping out almost as an afterthought. The pockets held her loan papers. Millie turned to her, her eyes wide. It's a story that's finally being told, she said softly. And Lydia, for the first time in years, felt lighter, not because of what she had lost, but because of what she had finally found.